In this video, you're going to see the small pirate republic of Oman take advantage of its benevolent Persian overlord to create a massive maritime empire and change the very nature of Omani society from a rowdy bunch of pirates to something greater than loot and money. This video is the continuation of a mega campaign series started in Crusader Kings 3, but the twist is that I swap nations once I hit a sort of peak with that country. The first episode saw us playing Portugal and creating a grand Andalusian empire, and in Crusader Kings 3, we established many great kingdoms and empires, some of which fell apart when I swapped, some of which didn't. Either way, check the description for those videos if you want the background on the campaign. Let's get into the video. Oman finds itself around its traditional land in a position of stagnation. A failed Republican coup some decades ago left Oman in a power vacuum as neither the Sultan nor any Republican rebels were able to assert proper power, and in that chaos, various warlords came to power. No faction won in particular, but the great power of Persia stepped in to prevent the total collapse of the Omani Sultanate, putting up whatever faction was organized enough to host a government in return for becoming a Persian-influenced state. The faction with the most power ended up being a group of entrepreneurial traders that had been accumulating money selling weapons to every side of the conflict, and these entrepreneurs would secure their control as an oligarchy over the former Sultanate. Eventually, with the protection of Persia, the untouched fleet of Oman found itself able to extort wealth from its neighbors, and before long, the Pirate Republic of Oman was born. The pirates of Oman did what they needed to in order to survive, really. Their economy was weak, and their status as a local power was in question as subjects of Persia. The raids on the Indian coast and the Horn of Africa gave Oman riches and some form of power, but ultimately there was no greater power than land and population, two things Oman lacked. To the end of obtaining more power and securing its position, Oman embraced the War Against the World doctrine and then declared war on the tiny state of Pate in East Africa. During the war, a new admiral was elected to the Omani throne, namely Etrek Bazi. Shortly after, Pate was conquered, and with it, the Omani fleet had access to raids in most of the Kilwan coast. From there, further expansion was limited by the simple realities of military power. Even though the Omani fleet was strong, this was not the place where it would be useful. A powerful land force was needed, but nowhere to be found. Instead of trying to train seaborne pirates to fight on land, the Omani pirates considered going where their naval advantage would best serve them. The fractured peoples of Indonesia were as of yet uncolonized and disunited. Majapahit, which once ruled a vast insular empire, was nothing compared to its former self. Omani ships arrived in Surabaya, but the vast distance from Muscat to Indonesia meant it would likely be impossible to actually conquer and control any land there. Instead, the goal of the war would be to subjugate them and use them as a puppet to control all of Indonesia and one day integrate them. A simple war came to a simple end in 1568 with Majapahit's defeat and total subjugation. With that war, Etrek Bazi also passed away, leaving a vacancy to be filled by the next pirate admiral, Jirgal Joma. He would guide the Republic down a path of mostly peace and raids, as well as the development of trade ports in Muscat using that money. The scent of opportunity did fill many nostrils of the Omani court as Delhi invaded Lanka and made great gains, but the potential for immense losses made Jirgal choose not to pursue the opportunity. About a decade and a half of peaceful raids and state building led to a prepared enough Omani army to invade more realms in Indonesia. Bali was a rich and beautiful island of the region which Majapahit laid claim to, and so on their behalf war was declared. It was a close and difficult war as the Sunda Empire had defended Bali, but an island just off the coast of Surabaya and a powerful navy meant that Jirgal's armies could never properly be destroyed, only temporarily set back. Ultimately, the problem was Sunda, so while their forces were fighting in Bali, Omani forces went west and occupied much of Java. The Sunda Empire was forced to surrender and abandon their Balinese allies as well as pay a tribute. The land leading up to the actual island of Bali itself was annexed right into Oman rather than into Majapahit, much to their disappointment, and thanks to that, Omani influence in the region could grow significantly now. Unfortunately, after declaring another war, the Sunda Empire once again got involved and this time pushed the Omanis to a significantly more dangerous position. The army had been stretched too thin fighting in the jungles of Indonesia, and so the war looked like it might end with a total Omani defeat and loss of all land in the region. But with some crafty naval maneuvers, the war goal was occupied and the war started to move back to Oman's favor. All the islands east and the land west of Bali fell under Omani control, which opened up the opportunity for huge raids across the region. Yet it wasn't enough. For access to true riches, the pirates knew where they had to set up shop next. The island of Formosa had become home to a Chinese warlord looking to gain influence from an isolated location, but his isolation will become his downfall as the Omani pirates landed on the island and annexed it. Pirate raids on never-before-seen scales ravaged South and Central China. Raiding was nice and all for income, but looking for some kind of stability, the pirates also invaded the Spice Islands in and around Ternate. The cloves there will become the staple export of the Republic, with every buyer knowing the blood that went into acquiring them. It turns out that in many ways, trade was more profitable than raids and didn't require the fleet to waste its time gallivanting about, but a real pirate knew you could get away with doing both, which is exactly what the Omanis did. Although the Omani Republic followed Shia Islam, it was obvious enough by this point that the religion was not at all a priority for them, which was a rising sentiment throughout the world by the turn of the 17th century. A good question that many of you might be wondering is why no one will declare war on these villainous pirates to eradicate the raids they've been committing for decades now, and that's because of the protection Persia is giving them. Persia is a significant world power out of the Middle East, and they do consider Oman to be in their cultural sphere. So long as Omani pirates never attack Persian coasts, which up to now they have not, there's no reason why the Persians will ever really care. The city of Malang had been growing as a pirate entrepot between the vassal state of Majapahit and their Omani overlords, and this would be the first sign of proper Omani settlement throughout the region. Up to now, the Omanis were administrators and conquerors, but they almost completely left the locals alone. Malang became something of a fortified city along the coast, watching for enemy ships and acting as a source of power in the region. At this point, all the disparate cultures and faiths of this incubating empire would rise up in rebellion basically constantly, mostly because pirates didn't do a particularly good job of keeping the people appeased. Omani pirates would brutally crush every rebellion and continue to extract wealth from their subjects brutally until they lost the spirit to fight. By the way, since I have never played pirates before, I didn't know that one of the later government reforms let you raise provinces, but once I found out about it, I did of course become completely fixated on it, because raising is so immensely powerful, and would play into my internal roleplay of marauding pirates quite well. By the way, one of the biggest roadblocks for Omani conquest up to now had been a lack of manpower. Quite frankly, Nizwa, Muscat, and its surrounding cities just don't have a ton of people to pull soldiers from, and there was too much distrust among the Indonesian and Formosan people to possibly put them in the army. Between years of war, the Omanis would spend years waiting for more recruits, but bleed those recruits to keeping their gains and killing rebels. The annexation of Majapahit in 1618 further harmed relations as a nation that was once a safe haven for refugees had been put under direct Omani control. Majapahit was a historical and cultural powerhouse that lent legitimacy to the Omani regime, but they were too greedy to let grand cities like Surabaya go undertaxed. This attitude of panache, confidence, and just total disregard for the significance of the lands they conquered led the Omanis to eventually become so confident they challenged another rising empire. China had collapsed under its own weight many decades ago, but that did not mean they were weak. The Chinese warring kingdoms were rabidly hostile to outsiders and would be almost impossible to defeat while they were so fervently fighting. Instead, Oman attacked the empire of the rising sun, Japan, which had recently made some excursions into Manchuria. The Japanese are by far the most powerful enemy that Oman has ever dealt with, but they landed just outside of Kyoto, seeing no fortress protecting it. First they took a port, and then they moved in, confronting the main Japanese army there. They were defeated, having underestimated their enemies, who they presumed were just some ragtag pirates. After Kyoto fell, the fortress to its northwest was the next target, but the overconfident pirates split their forces to take more ports and were caught out. They had to retreat to the port of Ise, but the Japanese did not make it easy. Kyoto fell almost instantly on account of there being no fortress, and then more than 40,000 Japanese men marched on Ise, while the Omanis panicked running for their ships. Rather than run though, their captains told them to stand their ground as reinforcements had just arrived. The independent army mercenaries had been hired and arrived just in time, but they were disorganized and were not able to save the pirates. The Japanese samurai cut down the pirates as they scattered across the countryside, but the Japanese hunted down each and every one of them, ending in a disastrous defeat for Oman. On the plus side, all the wages promised to those men no longer had to be paid, and Omani income skyrocketed. The war was not over though. Omani tenacity would not let Japan get away with all that slaughter. The fleet blockaded all of Japan, starving the country and cutting it off from Manchuria. Massive recruitment drives across the empire began, and a new army was being created, while the Japanese sat, their navy inadequate to break the blockade. Recruitment drives were often disturbed by the need to put down more rebels, meaning the Japan War turned into a sort of Cold War, with the Japanese waiting and learning to live without any ports, and the Omanis stewing in anger over the massacre at Ise. Over 5 years later, in 1625, the army was ready, and a new strategy was thought up. Japan, as an archipelago nation, has many possibilities for the navy to be a decisive factor in war. The relatively small island of Shikoku was a new landing ground for the Omani pirates. They quickly occupied the entire island, which the Japanese evacuated. A massive Japanese force sat across the straits, guarding the way to Kyoto. The Omanis had a plan though. Shikoku is indeed an island. The straits that kept Honshu safe could be their very downfall. The Battle of Bizen saw combat, but the pirates more or less knew they'd lose. That was the plan. It would cost some lives, but it would make the Japanese think they could thoroughly defeat the pirates by following their trail into Shikoku. The Japanese at first did not take the bait, but after nothing happened following the retreat, they reinforced and moved into Shikoku as the Omani fleet receded. A wiser general would have questioned the fleet's movement, but it was believed in the Japanese leadership that the fleets were preparing to evacuate the pirates. That was correct, as the pirates loaded onto the ships while a handful of others had already left the island, but not via boat. Aki and Bungo were both occupied, while the evacuated sailors feigned a retreat, instead disembarking in Setsu. The ships returned to their positions, blocking the straits, and provinces opposite the straits were occupied, preventing normal safe passage. 62,000 Japanese men were trapped in Shikoku with no escape, and so, everything in Japan was open. The Japanese army could do nothing, as entering the straits would result in total destruction at the hands of the Omani fleet. It might seem like the Omanis now had infinite time, but this is not the case. Rebels back home had taken advantage of the weakness and death that Japan was causing to occupy large portions of the empire. The Japan War had to be wrapped up, but the bitter Japanese would not surrender easily, knowing that even a small beachhead would make future pirate incursions much easier for them. Considering the straits were blocked though, it actually was reasonable to halt the war briefly, station a few guards to keep the straits safe, and go back to defeat the rebels, so that's what the Omanis did. In 1627, the army went back to Indonesia and crushed the rebels, while the Japanese army basically demobilized and sat in Shikoku, looking for food to eat. When the army returned to Honshu, its occupation would take many years, as the people there were fierce. Japan was a martial society, one which the pirates had come to have some respect for. They'd been at war for almost 10 years now, and the Japanese proved to be the only real adversary that could challenge Omani power. By 1630, the occupation was more or less complete, and also, I messed up and let the Japanese out of Shikoku. No lore for that, I just made a mistake. I guess the blockade couldn't be maintained as the skilled sailors of Oman weren't quite perfect, but either way, once the blockade was broken, peace was signed. Japan was bisected, and the imperial seat of Kyoto was stolen, alongside the entire island of Kyushu. It was an exhausting war, and as a reward, the sailors who achieved this monumental victory got to raid Korea, which was richer than any place the pirates had ever seen. The Hermit Kingdom had sat in undisturbed isolation for centuries, building up its public works and enjoying endless prosperity. Then the Omani pirates arrived. For the first time in generations, Koreans were killed in battle and pressed into the pirate navy. The immensely powerful Korean kingdom, unbeknownst to the Omanis, was about to wake up. These pirates had disturbed a nation that did not want to be disturbed. For now, the build-up will go unnoticed, but don't forget Korea and their immense rising power for the near future. Ignoring all that, the Omanis instead wanted to secure their shipping lanes from Surabaya to Tidore to Formosa and then to Kyushu and Kyoto. That meant conquering the Philippines. Again, like with Japan, the archipelago nature of the nations there meant it would be quite easy to conquer, as armies could easily be isolated on remote islands away from their ability to fight. Also, just a little note while the war was happening, Andalusia is competing with Kilwa for colonization of Australia. What a world. The war in the Philippines ended with most of Luzon going to Oman, and then Mindanao also falling. The Visayas Islands remained Philippine, but they would fall eventually. With these conquests, shipping lanes would be much more secure, although it was of course inefficient to travel east around Borneo instead of west through Malaysia, but for now the Malacca Sultanate was too strong to face on land and at sea. Peace returned to Oman, at least for now, and with it came the time to reflect on the lessons of war. It was true that the Omanis had triumphed over Japan, but that wasn't exactly because of their overwhelming superiority. Rather, they had basically gotten lucky with the island trap in Shikoku. In the future, pirate leadership did not want to be so easily defeated on land, even if they were more of a seaborne nation. It would be unwise to ignore the land war, so lessons from the Japanese war were integrated into the Omani strategies. Steel forged in Kyoto replaced the relatively shabby weapons the pirates were used to, and much of Japanese tactics and strategies were integrated into the minds of Omani leadership. This is reflected in the form of quality ideas taken in 1641. Sometimes it was easy to forget that the actual Omani capital was in fact still in Oman. So much of the focus of this pirate republic was in the east, yet at the end of the day, control over trade was in theory in service of pulling the trade back to Muscat. To facilitate that, the immense navy was finally put to commercial use. The light ships got to work guiding trade back to Oman, and when they did, Omani trade income skyrocketed from a measly 25 ducats each month to a whopping 58, a more than 100% increase. Of course, that income was supplemented with raids across China and Korea every couple of years, which made Oman immensely rich. By this point, the navy was focused on trade, and only a small portion of it was available to continue the war in Japan. With Japanese tactics now a strong part of Omani strategy, the Japanese would find themselves losing even land battles. The Shikoku strategy, while ingenious, was no longer necessary. That being said, it was such a funny story to the pirates to trap the Japanese on their own islands that they did it again anyway, and the Japanese fell for the same trap. At the same time as the island trap, the pirate government also embraced the new rule through loot reform, and they were intending to sack Japan for all its wealth. After most of Honshu was occupied, the weak Japanese army was still stuck in Shikoku, but rather than allow that army to stand, the powerful Omani army met them in the field, hoping to eradicate them and leave Japan a disarmed nation. The Japanese would have surrendered, but they had one Chinese ally in Qi, which had to be put in its place. Although perhaps a moment of hubris, the Omani leadership considered taking some land in Shandong with the hopes of using it to stage invasions in the rest of China one day. This ancient kingdom in shambles could be a source of truly immense wealth, and a small outpost on the continent could facilitate its sacking. Qi fell quickly, and for peace, they gave up Laizhou and all their money. Without allies, Japan also gave in, losing Shikoku and most of central Honshu. As reprisal for the death the Japanese had inflicted on Oman in their first invasion all those years ago, the entire countryside was raided and burned to the ground. The riches from that pillaging contributed yet more wealth to the immense trove of Omani power. Some among the Omani crew were starting to consider that piracy ought not be the way of the future. This was no longer some scrappy little realm on the edge of destruction looking for an advantage, but Oman had grown into effectively an empire of its own, which sat under benevolent Persian influence. So far, the Persians had done an excellent job defending Oman. Not a single war was declared on them to date, as all feared Persian reprisal. With the rise of manufacturing and high-skilled labor, the demand for slaves was going down, and the demand for proper goods rose. The pirates split into two factions, ones that wanted to settle down and begin manufacturing using all the goods across the empire, and the others wanted to fight productive nations and loot their goods for sale on the world market. There also was the matter of Omani demographics. With the conquest of Japan, Shintoism had become an immensely large faith among the population of the Republic. Islam had never really been much of a focus for Oman, as their way of life was shunned by pretty much anyone claiming to be a religious authority. Culturally, no particular culture was totally dominant, but the challenge of such a disunited empire split the pirates into yet another series of factions. They could leave it as is and fight off rebels as needed, they could aim for tolerance, or they could assimilate and settle their new lands with Omani natives. When debates escalated into arguments and inevitably fights, the pirates would settle the differences and go on a raid to satisfy everyone. The manufacturer pirates feigned disappointment at the raids, of course, but naturally, their greed was only human. No one was unhappy to become rich. By August of 1653, the Republic had amassed nearly 6,000 ducats worth of loot, and the hoard would only continue growing. In this period, the pirates got pretty eccentric, with a raiding party hearing about islands extremely far east in a land called Hawaii. It was only natural that the pirates would arrive there and promptly claim the islands for themselves. Hawaii didn't seem particularly useful, but it was just fun to take the lads off on an adventure somewhere far away, burn it down, plant a flag, and leave. The lackadaisical attitude the pirates had would mostly prevail, as the manufacturer pirates mostly settled down and were allowed to take their share of the treasure to create whatever factories and whatnot they wanted. In this debate, the raiders won. Where things got interesting for the pirates was their first defensive war. The Chinese warlords saw that Laizhou had fallen into foreign hands, and that could not be tolerated. The Persians were busy with their own affairs and chose to not aid Oman in the war. The Wu had made an alliance with Korea, which stacked the numbers immensely against the pirates. Of course, they would not surrender an inch of land without making their enemies fight for it, and so the rising factionalism in Oman was put on hold to defend the nation. The combined Korean, Shun, and Wun fleets were formidable, and caught out some trade fleets before the war fleet could arrive. An actual naval loss hadn't landed in Omani reports in a very long time. Once the proper fighting force did arrive, though, the enemy fleet was completely annihilated, with much of it being captured and repurposed for Omani use. That being said, the Koreans had been using new shipbuilding techniques to create what they called turtle ships that were doing a great job competing with the pirate fleet. To make things much worse, the Persians once again abandoned Oman to their fate when the African horn power of Adal declared war, looking to take advantage of the preoccupied Omani forces. Nizwa was attacked without any protection, as the entire army and fleet were busy in Asia. At this point, the Republic looked to be in grave danger, as the Omani flagship, Turat Masira, was sunk by the Korean turtle fleet. Trouble in the west and trouble in the east shook Omani society to the core. For once the pirate way was failing, an embarrassing peace had to be brokered, but the Chinese would not let them off easy. The Chinese, along with everyone else in East Asia, had lost so much to the pirate raids of the past century, and for that, punishment must be doled out. The Omanis returned all Chinese land to Wu, including Formosa, released a few minor nations in Indonesia disrupting their trade routes, and paid an immense war reparation worth 1,500 ducats to split among the victors. At least now the army and fleet were free to fight in Adal. Considering the impossibility of freeing Nizwa in this circumstance, it was decided that the Omani army would land in the Straits of Mukha and try to out-ravage the enemy in their own home. At the end of the day, the pirate government was run from the sea, not from the capital. Nizwa fell, but not its administration nor military leadership. The Adal War was surprisingly uneventful in comparison to the Chinese War. At the end of the day, the blockading of the straits was useful, but not decisive. As the Adalic army was able to obtain access to Egypt and Persia, they simply marched around the straits. It took a long time, but eventually the armies did butt heads, with the Adali forces being quite formidable. No pirate wanted more war after the disaster at Laizhou, so the war was ended with a minimal surrender. A small portion of Mara and the city of Pate were handed to Adal, and one of the recently conquered Hawaiian kingdoms was granted freedom. Peace was here. Now the pirates had to step back into the situation. Their streak of invincibility was over, and it was time to reform the country to better stand against the rising imperialist powers of the world. Too many Omani men had been dying to putting down rebels, which had a monetary and military cost that could not be sustained. It was decided that the country should focus on conquering small realms to accumulate more power and men to prepare for the world's offensive on piracy. Japan was a prime target of that sentiment, as they were completely isolated and weak. The Japanese had been invaded by the Chinese and lost all of their continental holdings alongside even Hokkaido. The rest of Japan was annexed by Oman before the Chinese could take it. It was decided that the prosperous, populated, and perfectly situated Japan would become the new Omani home. The capital had not been moved yet, but it was in the works. For now, the realm preferred to keep the capital in Nizwa, where it was safely tucked away from most of its oriental enemies. The Adali Sultanate likely wouldn't try such a bold war again, at least for some time. Central Japanese Saigoku people were accepted in Omani administration as a sort of elevated class among the Japanese. They were the most intellectual and productive of the Japanese cultures, and by accepting them, the tolerant faction of pirates was looking like it might win out. In a rather unexpected moment, though, the Japanese administrators that had been welcomed into the government did not collaborate. They feigned loyalty and obtained meaningful positions in government, only to sabotage the country from the inside. A new government took charge of the republic from Japan, with a great many business owners and urbanites from Kyoto, Bizen, and Ise staging a coup. Oman, the nation as we know it, was no more, as a new administration was formed by the Japanese merchants, who promised many of the Omani pirates a place in the new government with bribes and promises of glory and adventure in service of a new government. This new Japan, still run from Nizwa by Japanese administrators, was a very strange nation. Much of the laws and ways of the Omani people had been kept as a compromise with the treasonous pirates, some of whom were uncomfortable with the state religion coming about. The Japanese agreed to keep Shia Islam as the official faith of the republic, but also agreed to leave all religious minorities undisturbed. They also agreed to allow the pirates to continue their piratic action on account of the benefits it brought and the desire to keep the coup bloodless. Previous Omani leadership was executed, and among the Omani pirates, a new Bushido code was established, which is something most of the soldiers were already familiar with after studying Japanese ways of war. The new Japanese Bushido pirate samurai regiments were ready to create a new Japan. I suppose in a way Japan ended up winning the struggle against the Omanis in a way, just in a different sort of way. The Omanis became second-class citizens except for those that joined the army and accepted Japanese overlordship. Nizwa was changed from a city of Omani culture and power to an outpost of Japanese control, lording it over the whole peninsula. The Japanese government certainly preferred peace to war, and so a period of immense development struck Japan. The lands that had been ravaged so before by the pirates were now being tilled by the pirates in a swords to plowshare system. Loyal Omani samurai were required to work land in Japan in return for a larger share of the loot they took in their raids, but no man was a slave. The pirates would not have it. Any man who was willing to part with his loot was allowed to keep his freedom. Of course, no real pirate would ever let his loot go. While all this sounds very prosperous, one of the very first events to mark this new government's leadership was a tragic fire in Musashi. Most considered it a bad omen. Alongside that, tensions in Japan rose when the so-called pirate samurai were becoming quite unruly. Apparently the strict discipline of the Bushido Code didn't quite vibe with the freedom-loving pirate antics that the Omanis so loved. In due time, though, the Japanese government was confident they'd fall in line. The first foe these unruly samurai were to be unleashed on were the Shun, whose Indian ally was too busy to defend them. Parts of Japan proper were occupied by foreigners, which could not stand. During this war, the first Japanese pirate admiral took control of the republic, as previously a puppet Omani pirate, Said, had been ruling as a figurehead. The pirates ultimately were proving quite loyal, as the loot under Japan was great, and for many of the young men in the army, the Bushido Code's discipline was both a guiding principle in life, and a pretty cool thing to talk about at the pub with the boys. Admiral Tomohito Shoni took control of the republic and led the war against the Shun with great courage. The Shun ultimately were a collapsing Chinese kingdom, as in this period of Chinese history, dynasties came and went with the wind. The land of Japan they had stolen was returned, and as extra reparation, the province of Gaizhou was ceded, along with a trove of ducats. The unification of the realm triggered what could become known as the Edo period, and was marked by both the rise in development and prosperity across Japan, and the foundation of an effective Japanese bureaucracy to manage the loot and labor system that embodied Japanese society. The Edo period's great peace saw the drilling of the rowdy samurai into a proper force, and the raiding campaigns were now far more organized. Much of the Japanese army had an immense loyalty to the state instilled into them through the Bushido Code, whose rules became the new pirate code. It was certainly true that under the Japanese administration there was a lower income for the state, as less effort was put into constant raiding and protection of trade routes, but the wise pirates knew that in peace came more permanent prosperity. Also, quick note here, I got raided by Do It For Bruce on Twitch while streaming the Mega Campaign. He's a CK3 content creator that does what he does for his cat. Respect. Check out his channel, and thanks for the raid, Kevin. Either way, to wrap up this Edo developmental period, it culminated in me picking economic ideas and staying mostly at peace. I was drilling my soldiers looking to create an elite fighting force that could eventually defeat the Koreans, because ultimately the Korean fleet and army were quite fearsome. Alongside that, their land was so developed that I couldn't help but want to burn it down. In 1687, private businesses and entrepreneurship became a huge focus for many pirates that found themselves bored between raids. The Quartermaster group was found, which was a collection of business owners and urbanites that wanted greater rights for their economic interests. As part of their rise, the laicity of Japan expanded greatly, with secularism gripping the nation in an unprecedented move for the era. It was still the case that Muslims were the most highly regarded group only because they had been previously in the Omani administration, and institutional discrimination can take time to dismantle, but in good time, true equality and religious freedom may yet be reached. Oh, another thing, real quick. Sometimes during the playthrough, I swap countries for a second just to see how they're doing. I did this earlier to check on Anatolikon. I didn't do anything, but I did turn on debug mode just for a moment to do the swap. Normally I remember to turn it off right away, but I actually forgot to this time, so for a little while here, let's see some debug mode stuff if you're attentive. Rest assured, I'm not cheating or anything, I just forgot to turn off debug mode. Hope that's okay. Anyway, this period of peace kind of dragged on. I would say that, like, it's totally boring, but it's not that it's so boring to play, it's that it's boring to describe. Basically, I raided, I did development, and I did my missions. It was a lot of fun to watch live because I was just rambling about God knows what to my chat and watching my incoming manpower just shoot to the moon. Ultimately, if you're interested in more of the moment-to-moment gameplay, consider checking out the streams, which happen pretty inconsistently, but, you know, they happen when they happen. If you subscribe, you'll be alerted when I stream on YouTube. I normally stream on both YouTube and Twitch, so pick your platform. Thanks. The entire world was evolving significantly by the turn of the 18th century. Life in Japan had become more normal and aligned with the rest of the world, except that every once in a while the fleet left port, burned down China, Indonesia, Western India, Indochina, and parts of Arabia to stimulate the economy. The Edo period naturally kicked off a golden age for Japan, starting officially in 1694, although it was not explicitly because of this peaceful development that it would become known as a golden age. Rather, it was what this period of peace would enable in the coming decades that made it what it was. By 1700, the Japanese army had been reformed with huge samurai blocks and new techniques with the hopes of outclassing everyone in Asia. Comparing the military quality in the ledger, we see Japan here with over 6.5 morale and 125% discipline, and keep in mind that my entire front line on most of my armies is composed entirely of samurai, so make that more like 130%. The city of Hansong was immensely rich by this point, and although Korea had once defeated the Omanis, it would not happen to Japan. It wasn't yet time to fight them, but in preparation, the Edo period's unending peace finally came to an end. The previously lost territories from the Chinese War had to be reclaimed, and first up were the Philippines. Unfortunately, the Cebu kingdom was allied with the Marathas, who had made a compromise with their rival Delhi, while expanding east in the chaotic China. On the coast of the Visayas Islands, the massive but unskilled Marathi fleet met the Japanese pirate fleet, and it was a difficult fight. This was just a scouting battle. Now the tactics and ideas of the Marathi fleet were known to Japan. Where small Marathi fleets could be cut off, they were intercepted. As part of the greater war plan for the campaign in China and Korea, this war with the Marathas was actually convenient. The warlord of Wu had made an alliance with the Marathas in the hopes of obtaining hegemony over China, but because the Marathas were already at war with Japan now, they could invade Wu without Marathi involvement. Against Wu alone, Japan could easily prevail and potentially gain huge amounts of land in South and Central China. While that war was just beginning, the war in the Philippines was going well. The Marathas in Luzon were defeated, while the Marathi fleet was caught out off the coast of Malang, which you might remember was established as an Omani outpost explicitly for spotting ships about a century ago. It wasn't a decisive battle, as the Marathi fleet did escape, but it lost many of its heavy ships. The fleet retreated to a port in Flores, but before it could repair, Japanese marines landed to force the ships out of port. This naval battle would be the end of the Marathi fleet until it could be rebuilt, and it was a devastating loss for them. Well, it was the end of one Marathi fleet. Turns out they had a few other squadrons ready to replace them, which would prove tough targets for the tired-out Japanese sailors. The Marathis did not have skilled sailors nor a maritime culture, but they had immense ship output, and they could just keep throwing ships at their enemies. Also, by October of 1705, Kyoto was converted to Shia. I did this just to simulate some of the Omani influence, but ultimately it's not meant to be reflective of actual governmental religious conversion, or just a natural trend of Muslim settlers from Oman. The war in Wu was going much more slowly, as the warlord there managed to build up a much larger army than expected. After landing in Wenzhou, the Japanese samurai columns were about to test their skills in battle against a huge opponent. The Chinese had many more men, but they were of low quality comparatively. Japanese leadership was confident that with their superior weapons, armor, and tactics they could win. An epic battle in Fuzhou began with Japanese success, albeit at a larger cost than expected. Losing so many well-trained men is not sustainable, and so, the battle, although a victory, was deemed a failure in the eyes of the generals. The saving grace was that the Chinese soldiers were so disorganized that they kept filtering in, and by pure chance, a clueless Chinese army was annihilated at the cost of less than 1,000 samurai. The war against Cebu ended with their full annexation afterwards, and now the Marathas could join the Wu War if they wanted to. They did. By the time they arrived, the Wu capital had fallen, and with it the protection for the undisciplined masses of Chinese warriors. Japanese samurai shot their guns in formation across the South Chinese hills, and cannons made of the strongest Japanese metals in Kyushu decimated the countryside. The Chinese losses were immense, although it is a strength of the Chinese to always have lots of men to throw into war. Nonetheless, the Battle of Wenzhou saw the kinds of casualty ratios the Japanese generals were hoping for in the future. 49,000 enemies dead or captured for just over 5,000 Japanese casualties. A massive Marathi Wu army assembled in Fuzhou, and with nearly 3-to-1 numbers, the Japanese army was forced to retreat, but not without claiming more than 2 times as many lives as they lost. The army went to Formosa to occupy and reinforce for a while, as their enemies wasted their time taking back their own capital. More and more disastrous battles for the Chinese ended with the ground running red with blood. Once the entirety of the south was occupied, the warlord had to surrender, and the peace deal was immensely harsh. Canton and all its hinterlands alongside the island of Hainan were annexed. It was only natural that the samurai were allowed to loot and pillage, but with the Bushido Code's new discipline, this was not some chaotic looting. Instead, it was an ordered liquidation of every asset in the region. Ornamental buildings in Canton were stripped, and men above certain heights enslaved, the others killed. The brutality here was of a different sort than the Omani pirate era. Greed was understandable. The wish for wealth and power made sense, but this destruction felt like what we might call today robotic, although no such idea was around at the time. It was described by Chinese writers as demonic, while in Japanese history, it was seen more as a form of reparation for the previous war with Wu that the Omani Republic lost. Regardless of perspective, the loss of life and wealth was immense. From the lessons of the conquest of Canton, the samurai learned much and refined the Bushido Code to focus even more strongly on gunpowder warfare. Also, Byzantium is back. Nice. Keep in mind they have Egypt as a personal union, so they're even bigger than it might seem. From here, a very interesting war came upon Japan, and that was an attempted encroachment from the overconfident French Empire. The French by this point in the world had colonized some of the New World, but were mostly outclassed by the Andalusians in the colonial game. To offset that, they were looking to build a colonial empire in the east, but they chose, of all nations to attack, Japan. Keep in mind that our Japanese empire here is indeed still a subject of Persia, so the great power of Persia will be aiding Japan in its defense. Nonetheless, the French still have at least the numbers advantage. It won't prove particularly useful though if they can't rally those men into battle effectively. The first battle of the war naturally was a naval battle again on the coast of Malang. The French fleet felt like it was made of paper in response to Japanese cannons, which by now were seasoned against the Marathi fleet and found the French to be a real pushover. The war was already off to a great start, as the French simply can't get any men into the right positions to be threatening due to their failing naval abilities. The combined French and Kilwan fleets were defeated on the coast of Dimak, which saw most of the French heavy fleet sunk. The battle was so disastrous that Kilwa signed a peace a few days later, but the French charged on, during the humiliation of defeat to a non-European power. Nonetheless, without Kilwa's support, the French lost confidence and chose to surrender. The Japanese pirates demanded an immense war operation with over 5,000 ducats coming to the Japanese, some of which was paid to Persia as thanks for their support, even if they didn't do much. Using the money from France, as well as the trove of ducats the pirates had acquired from South China, firearms manufacturers were sponsored to become the greatest weapons craftsmen of the world. Guns were the future, and the samurai had already embraced them, but the war on the front line was not enough. There had to be a war at home to make the best and most guns. This war at home and war on the front line became a huge part of Japanese strategy with regards to war. They had begun to think of war on both the economic and military front, which was to be used in a great war against the continually expanding Maratha Empire. The Marathis had expanded immensely in China and Indochina, which made them a huge threat to Japanese power. Alongside that, the Europeans, which had been slowly working their way into the power balance of the region, had their tendrils in the Marathas. The British allied themselves with the Marathis after seeing the French humiliation into China, hoping to continue the Japanese threat. Rather than be deterred though, Japan was confident it could defeat the Marathas and the British. War was declared, and the pirate fleet blocked the Palk Straits to occupy all of Lanka. This strategy was powerful, but the Marathas responded in kind by occupying South China. Given that the land there was rich, this was painful, but Chinese death was a sacrifice that the Japanese were willing to make. The Maratha capital of Kandy fell quite simply because the haughty Indians had never considered fortifying their island capital. Afterwards, the army marched into Madurai, believing that even if the Marathas did return, it was likely they could be defeated. They seemed to prefer staying in South China for now, though. What force did arrive was the British and Marathi Navy, for which the Japanese fleet was prepared. Indeed, the combined Anglo-Indian Navy was massive and scary, but with size came a lack of maneuverability. The Japanese fleet, somehow, despite the numbers, absolutely destroyed the enemy, even humiliating the British by capturing their flagship. I don't know how naval combat works really, nor does anyone really, from what I know. Basically, I somehow won this huge battle and destroyed an immense number of ships. I have no idea how or why. I thought I would lose. 42 heavy ships were sunk, and my admiral was actually worse than their admiral, by the way. Now you might be impressed by me capturing that flagship, but hilariously enough, I captured yet another British flagship in the Visayas Sea, which is just hilarious. That implies that they built another one, sent it out, and they get captured again. I of course named both Perfidious Albion to entertain chat, but also because I don't know enough Japanese to be creative about their names. Leave a comment if you got an idea for a Japanese flagship name. Fighting continued, but India laid bare, and the Marathas simply weren't responding. I was baffled during the stream by this. I really can't think of why they're just letting me destroy their country. In 1731, the British offered a white peace, which was their way of avoiding the humiliation that the French experienced. They could walk away with only their flagship's capture as a shame. When the British exited the war, this somehow motivated the Marathi army to return home, and so fighting began on the ground in Bengal. The Indian elephants were impressive and all, but a Japanese cannon could put a hole in an elephant before it could reach the infantry. Japanese armies did not bother with cavalry, when guns could fight with more speed, more ferocity than any steed. Japanese guns showed their power in the Battle of Goragat, where Mihito Shoni led his forces to kill 46,000 Indian soldiers. He continued the pressure, taking his men to Bhagalpur to kill even more enemies. The Indians were being shredded by Japanese gunpowder. The war continued like this, with immense Indian death forcing the Marathi hand to sign the treaty. All of Lanka was taken, and the land that the Marathas had in the Philippines was confiscated. There was really only one more target of Japanese aggression that needed to be defeated to mark Japan as a true hegemon of the East at this point, and that was Korea. The Hermit Kingdom was allied to a handful of Chinese warlords, but ultimately, their power was not as concrete as it appeared. Korean soldiers were fearsome at first, but through war with India, China, and Europe, the samurai pirates had become even more fearsome. War in Korea was declared, and a Japanese flagship flanked by 2 British flagships sailed to Hansong. Unfortunately, as cool as it sounds, the Korean fleet was still really strong and did defeat my navy. Kind of anticlimactic. The story was different in Hansong. The walls there were obliterated by Japanese artillery, and the people in the city, who had never known hunger nor pain, were starving. The city fell in October of 1741, but the army chose to move to the next fort, only occupying the city, not burning it down. That will come in due time. A massive Korean host fought to reclaim the city, which prompted the samurai to move back into Hansong, where a bloodbath ensued. At the cost of just 8,000 men, some 40,000 Koreans were killed and sent packing into the mountains. Their cowardly Chinese allies, who did not even participate in the battle, were not spared either, as they were caught and killed just south of the city. More Koreans attempted to take the city back, and this time, there was not a shred of mercy for them. The Koreans, seeing that Japanese guns were dominating, chose to make cannons of their own, but foolishly built far too many, resulting in a destroyed front line. The cannons, without range to make them safe, were extremely vulnerable and thus captured and thrown away. Their craftsmanship was of too poor quality to be acceptable in the Japanese army. Another Korean army was destroyed in Cheongju, and it wouldn't be long until the Koreans would be forced to surrender. The Marathas had foolishly intervened in the war, but their intervention only resulted in their land being ravaged for a white peace. Now Korea was alone, and in that solitude their entire peninsula was occupied and devastated. The Japanese demands were harsh, but Korea had no choice. All the richest sections of Korea were taken into Japan. The city of Keijo, once Hansong, was sacked. Even after its absolute desecration, it still stood a metropolis of the east, as did many Korean cities. The whole region was just so built up that its conquest more or less ended the possibility of a Korean comeback. Much of the Korean development was stolen and taken to Nizwa to build up the imperial capital, and indeed, the desert city was turned into a metropolis of its own off the back of foreign materials entirely. Integrating these Korean cities will take time, but why wait? The samurai invaded more of China, attacking Wu again, hoping to conquer more of the coast. This massive peace deal saw some of the most populous regions of China fall into Japanese hands, and once they did come in, they were no longer the most populous regions of China. It's honestly pretty heinous how much death is represented by all this looting, but look, now Nizwa has 53 development, so that's cool. By the time all that land was cored and stated, Japanese income hit new highs off of just the productivity of that land, let alone the trade and tax they contributed. From here, Japan began to calm down, as an imperial power. It could conquer more, but what more do the Japanese have to prove? Obviously, the conquest of Korea ought to be completed, and perhaps a few more conquests in Malaysia to control trade in that region better, but it's all kind of superfluous at this point. By 1765, I was getting bored playing Japan. I was mopping up Korea, but then an opportunity arose. Japan received word of an interesting occurrence. A colony of the British, rather 13 of them, broke free somehow. Such an act of rebellion was unheard of, but the 13 colonies were free, and I decided that I was going to immediately swap over to the USA. From here, I continued on in my last swap for EU4 as the United States, and I was just hoping to see some interesting content before going to Victoria 3. The United States ended up being a pretty fun country to play since I could attack all the European colonies without worrying about their overlords, but you can see the details of that in the next and final episode of the EU4 Mega Campaign section coming in a couple days. If you watched this long, thank you so much, and I hope you'll enjoy what's up next. Don't forget that once all the sections of the EU4 Mega Campaign are done separately, I'll be uploading the director's cut of the EU4 section to my channel, and then after that, combining it with the CK3 section to create a damn long video. See you then, and thank you for your time. Do we leave Japan to its fate and go play America?